Welcome, everyone. My name is Gordon Stables. I'm the director of the USC Annenberg School for Journalism. I want to thank you all for joining us. Today's discussion is hosted by the USC Annenberg School of Journalism in collaboration with the the Institute of Armenian Studies. Thanks to Melvin for the inspiration for this discussion and for all the participants and panelists for making their time available and for being here today. And I also want to thank our fantastic events and operation teams who are helping to produce this session. And I know it used to be cliche for us to say that our world was getting smaller, but in these last 400 days, I think we've seen ways in which previously unimaginable barriers have been erected politically, culturally, and even within ourselves emotionally to our visibility, our access, and our understanding of the broader world. In many ways, it seems cliche to be thinking about the world getting smaller, that for many of us, we've been defining the world by the size of our Zoom screen for now 13 months. And when there's so much pressure locally, nationally, and internationally for communities to turn inward and to redefine themselves on some historical or some imagined idea of who or what they are, the idea of refocusing the conversation to global, engaged, and important international journalism might seem less pressing, but I would contend it's even more important today. And I know we get the benefit of being in a university setting, so the notion of being a global community is never far from our thoughts, whether that's because we're working to support a student, faculty, and staff community that is quite literally having class around the world in real time. But it's also this notion of the way that we come to understand what our world is and will be. And I think whether you're seeing the stories coming out of Brazil or India from a notion of the human suffering, or in perhaps a slightly more selfish moment thinking about if people in the world continue to struggle with this pandemic, how do any of us define what comes next? These are global questions. These are questions that communities that need to engage. And I think the timing of our event today also signals that the idea of keeping history as part of this dialogue and part of this conversation. And part of why I wanted to thank Melvin at the outset is that this idea came up months ago, and I don't know that any of us would have envisioned that the news of the last week being the press and or really providing the foundation for it. But it's an important way to remember and think about all of the people, all of the work, and all of the effort over years that went into that important recognition. History is neither local nor past. And the connecting tissue to all of that is journalism, the voice, the translator, the record of what happens within and across our worlds and our communities. And so that's why I'm so thankful for the remarkable journalists, including many of the folks on our panel today, who have done and continue to do this important work of international reporting. And within that, I find essential to offer one last reminder that while we often reinforce the virtues, values, and responsibility of journalism, it's also important to keep in mind the infrastructure that exists to support these journalists. In much of the world, and especially within the United States, we rightly expect a great deal from our reporters and news outlets, even if we're far less clear on who and how should pay for the foundations of that work. So I'm looking forward to sitting back and enjoying this fantastic discussion. And I just encourage everyone, especially the audience, to consider in mind that reinforcing not only the virtues of producing this high quality of global affairs journalism, but also the idea of economic support that makes this important, but often expensive work possible. And great journalism is a partner to its community, and today's event reflects the best kind of partnerships. So I'm incredibly thrilled to step away and turn the platform over to my remarkable colleague and someone I've really enjoyed getting the opportunity to work with over these past few years, the director of the USC Dornsife Institute for Armenian Studies, Salpi Ghazarian. Salpi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gordon. The appreciation is certainly mutual, and I do hope that our collaboration goes farther and deeper. We're lucky to have you where you are. I want to introduce my partners in this endeavor, the panelists, and then talk a little bit not just about how to cover these unpronounceable and visible conflicts, but also why. So let me introduce them one at a time. Adi Ignatius, he's the one who's come farthest. Adi is editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business Review. And when I asked him to participate, he said, oh, I haven't been a foreign correspondent in so many years. But when he was for Time, for the Wall Street Journal, in Hong Kong, in Beijing, and Moscow. So Adi, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
We are hoping to get Sandy Tolan in as well. Sandy has covered more than 40 countries. He's a professor at the Annenberg School. His book, The Lemon Tree, is a bestseller. So hopefully Sandy will wander in. Maral Tavitian is an alumna of the Annenberg School. She has worked as a journalist. She's worked as an analyst. And now she's completing her second year at USC Gould School of Law. So Maral has decided she's going to fix the world one way or another. Maral, welcome.
Thank you, Salpi.
And finally, Syuzanna Petrosyan, who is an alumna of the Annenberg School and my colleague at the Institute of Armenian Studies. She's an associate director. Syuzanna is also very deeply involved with CivilNet, which is an online news platform based in Armenia. And she was one of those who worked around the clock during the war to connect the international media to the right people on the ground. Suze, as always, welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, and there is Sandy Tolan. He has joined us. Sandy, you're there. We may ask you to change your name from Silva Sevlian to Sandy Tolan, if that's okay. Otherwise, welcome. I've introduced you and I'm so glad you're here. Thank you. I'm going to say a little bit, before we start talking, I'm going to say a little bit about the topic. How to cover invisible conflicts in places you cannot pronounce. And very briefly, let me tell you about the conflict, the war that was the catalyst for this discussion. Although, as Gordon said, everything we say will be relevant to so many places. And even though we're talking about war, but covering areas of crisis, whether Brazil or India these days with the tragic, dramatic surge in COVID that they are experiencing, the challenges, the problems are not very different. But in any case, let me tell you a little bit about the war first. And Jason will help us with a map that kind of places this unpronounceable, used to be invisible place. So Karabakh, or Artsakh, as Armenians also call it, is an Armenian populated region that in the Soviet period was placed under Azerbaijani sovereignty. So you see it's this white area in the middle of the yellow area. And right before the war started, September 2020, this is how it looked. That is Armenia and Azerbaijan, two independent countries, two of the 15 republics that made up the Soviet Union. And together with Georgia, they are the region that's called the Caucasus, another unpronounceable, often misspelled term. This is a mountainous, rugged region. Over the centuries, it's been divided in all sorts of ways that put parts of the peoples living there under either the Russian Empire rule or the Persian Empire or sometimes the Ottoman Empire. In the waning days of the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan held a referendum to leave the Union, the Soviet Union, and it did so. And Karabakh held a referendum to leave Azerbaijan, and it did so. But it was met by first pogroms, massacres, and then a full-on military onslaught. And the Armenians from Armenia joined the Armenians of Karabakh to defend them. And in 1994, the Armenians won. And they also took under their control the surrounding territories, both as a security buffer, but also as a bargaining chip for achieving independent status for Karabakh outside of the sovereignty of Azerbaijan. And you can see that land there. So Karabakh is the white in the middle. The yellow is the territories they took under their control. All of that within the internationally recognized borders of Azerbaijan and Armenia immediately to the west. And you see the neighborhood, Russia to the north, Georgia to the north, Iran to the south, Turkey to the west. In September, Azerbaijan, after having built up the military using all sorts of petroleum revenue, Azerbaijan has lots of petroleum revenue, attacked, won, and by November 10th, the surrounding territories, the yellow territories, had gone back to Azerbaijani control, and even part of the southern part of Karabakh had, the part that's the closest to the Iranian border. We've called this, thanks Jason, we've called this the war that came to Los Angeles, because there are about 1 million Armenians here, and they are all somehow connected to Armenia, either because they lived there for years, as I did, or because they have family there, or because they come and go and they visit. So now that we've said we want to talk about how to cover this conflict, I want to talk a little bit about why. And Gordon said some things about the why, and I am sure my colleagues are going to say some more. The why in this case, for example, starts with something as simple as local community. Yes, these conflicts, Myanmar is distant. There's a Burmese community in Los Angeles, and it deserves to know what's happening in its homeland, former host land. That's one reason. The other reason is the world is small, Gordon said, but also because conflicts have extended consequences. You saw the region, Russia, Turkey, Iran. This is a conflict that has all sorts of tail and continuation. So it's not just Armenia and Azerbaijan fighting over land, memories, the right of people to the life of their choice, human rights. It's not just local, it's much bigger than that. It's also DEI continued. Conflict happens because people live in inequitable situations, because they are not included. It takes on specific sorts of form domestically. It has in the United States. The conflict against the absence of DEI, the absence of diversity, equity, inclusivity. But it is still not very different in other places in the world. This is about basic civil and human rights. And it's about history. Journalists are the primary historians. So for all of those reasons, we must cover these places we don't know and these places we can't pronounce. So this war was covered. 44 days, incredible military onslaught, a new sort of war in many ways based on what the analysts said. So I want to start with Adi and just kind of ask you, Adi, as a sophisticated consumer, how was the war covered? What do you think?
Well, there are a lot of ways to answer that question. I mean, I think you got at it in some ways at the beginning. You know, in 2020, it was difficult for people who didn't have a stake in this war to really commit to understanding it. I mean, that is just a reality. For a lot of people, it was far away, and the kind of global significance wasn't immediately apparent or fully apparent. And then there were a lot of people who did pay attention to varying degrees. You know, I follow the coverage. I tend to read mostly, you know, mainstream, the Washington Post, the New York Times, things like that, and followed how they covered it. I did watch CivilNet's coverage. Places like, you know, Vice Media went and did some interesting programming from there. I would, you know, the big problem is the historical problem. How far back do you go? You know, do you start in 2020 and identify an aggressor and say it's clear who the aggressor is and who the victims are, and have an opinion based on that? Do you go back to 1994 and say, well, that's when this started and this is retribution for that? Do you go back, you know, to the founding of the Soviet Union? Do you go back to the Ottoman Empire? There's no answer to that, and all of those sort of time points are relevant. They also make it hard for. So I would say, you know, your basic consumer of news probably thinks this war went catastrophically badly for Armenia. It did so because of a kind of unexpected and unusual first move aggression from Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey and Syrians and you know, Israel, probably Russia to varying degrees. But that maybe they took back territory that had been wrested away from them. So I think it's, you know, beyond the Armenian community, I'm not sensing a sort of a sense of outrage that the Armenians feel. I'm not declaring who's right and who's wrong. Your question was, how was it covered? And there are two questions: how was it covered and how was it perceived? And I think, you know, I didn't cover this war. I've covered wars. It is very, very difficult to get good information, to get reliable information. In some ways, it was an unbalanced situation. You talked about global struggles. In some ways, this is a struggle between a democracy and an autocracy. In a democracy, information is readily available, whether it's death counts or reliable descriptions of what's happening on the ground. That's Armenia. In Azerbaijan, it's basically an oil-rich autocracy. I don't think to this date there have been any reliable figures released on casualties and things like that. So that there is sort of a basic imbalance. I think that's relevant. I think that says a lot about the nature of the struggle, and I don't think some of that context was adequately reported. But I'll stop now.
Yeah, and that's part of the question that we're definitely going to ask, and I know Maral will want to say something about that. I want to ask Syuzanna, who was covering this, covering the coverage, day and night, following through, helping, as a distant fixer, if you can figure that out, but she did it. Syuzanna, talk about some of the specifics of what Adi already pointed to. How, in fact, was it covered? Who covered it? How did they cover it? Where did parachutes fit in?
Yeah. So in my capacity working with the English section team for CivilNet, Armenia-based CivilNet, as well as an associate director at the Institute of Armenian Studies at USC, I work with a lot of journalists during the war who flew to Karabakh during the 44 days. And I want to start off by saying that coverage, perhaps this is obvious, but coverage really mattered during this war, and it always matters more than in other circumstances during wars. And this is because it impacts policy, it impacts aid shipments, involvement of humanitarian organizations. And here coverage also mattered because there was this massive misinformation campaign going on online with thousands of Twitter bots, thousands of Facebook fakes who were trying to manipulate the information space. So real journalism really made a big difference. So going back to Salpi's question about how this war was covered, I want to share my screen.
As Syuzanna is sharing her screen, I just want to say, if you have questions along the way, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them.
So I would say this war was covered in an extreme situation. It was covered mostly without context, and in the US, it was mostly not covered. So what do I mean by extreme situation? For days on, sometimes for weeks, both local and international journalists were unable to leave the bomb shelters to go out there and do their jobs. And when they did, it was extremely unsafe. The capital of Karabakh, Stepanakert, the biggest city, was being shelled for days on end, sometimes for hours without stopping. So they were hitting residential buildings, hospitals, churches. This is a picture of one of the most important churches that was shelled twice in the city of Shushi. So the first time that it was shelled, a ton of journalists flocked in to try to get footage. And then while they were there, another bomb fell. And there were a couple journalists and fixers who were injured, So all the cars in the city are being used to take supplies to the front line and bring back injured soldiers back to the city. So there's no drivers available to take people from place to place. So to illustrate all of this, I want to play short segments from a video. One is from the Vice one, which went to Karabakh during the war, and the other segment is from CivilNet. And I believe, okay, we can get that going, Jim. Great.
Come here and help other kids. That was the most difficult part.
What actually? Okay.
Did you know that the average adult has 5 to 20 pounds of toxic poop in their body at any given moment? Seems crazy, right?
There's the economic support. Okay, you can skip the ad.
All right.
This is a reality. Usually we get a little siren, so we know we need to go into the bunker. But sometimes siren doesn't work, so we get the bomb before the siren. But that's okay. We're getting used to it.
Getting used to the non-stop bombardment means civilians are abandoning the streets and taking cover underground in some of the same shelters they built 30 years ago. How often are you hearing this sound these days?
Okay, we can go to the next video. Mhm.
Where? By luck, we could escape. This was not the case for our French colleagues from the Le Monde newspaper. Alain Caval and Raphaël Yagobzadeh were heavily injured by multiple rocket launchers. Their driver, a young man of 20-year-old, died with fragments of shells pushed in his flesh. The next day, we went to Martuni again. Despite imminent danger, women prepare 100 to 150 pieces of bread every day to feed the soldiers on the front line. For the villages, there is no alternative. They have to protect their land. In Stepanakert, the bombardments were becoming more and more regular, more and more deadly. We spent 2 days in the shelter of a school to avoid the shelling. It was impossible to go outdoors. The offensive against civilians was launched and hasn't stopped yet. In 30 days, the civilian infrastructures, including schools, kindergartens, and houses, were destroyed. More than 40 civilians died, and 116 others were wounded. Most of the weapons used by Azerbaijan are banned by conventions under international law. Grads and smerches embedded in the buildings of towns and villages are multiple rocket launchers that target large areas, killing and injuring everyone.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Okay, so you can see what I meant when I said extreme situation. And in addition to this, shortly after the war begins, COVID cases, for obvious reasons, begin to rise in Armenia dramatically. People are living in these types of basement shelters with multiple families, and they're not quarantining or isolating. So there's this zero social distancing. And of course, all of this makes the job for journalists and fixers immensely difficult. I also said that the war was covered mostly without context. The outlets that came at the start of the war and stayed and then returned after the war, like PBS, AFP, they were able to capture the whole picture. Those who parachuted in and sort of did their assignment and left missed the larger picture. As Salpi mentioned, this place has a complicated history. It has a long history, and definitions matter, maps matter. Every single point and every single line in a map matters. So this was kind of missed among some of the international journalists who parachuted in. And there was also fixation on equating both sides, but wars are rarely equal. So, for example, for a piece that you would interview both leaders, both heads of Azerbaijan and Armenia, that's fine, but adding context would mean to mention that one of them is a democratically elected leader, and the other one is a dictator who inherited the country from his father.
Can I interrupt you and ask Maral to come in?
Sure.
Because I think that some of what you're saying, especially about context, is one of the points that Maral has been making, on various platforms. And Maral, before I ask you to jump in, I just want to make something really clear that, again, we're talking about Armenians and the government of Azerbaijan's assault. We would be, as observers, as journalists, as scholars, hopefully asking the same questions regardless of where this is happening. And at the end of the day, the fundamental question is, how do governments get away with attacking their own citizens? Where are journalists and government officials, number one? And number two, the importance of context and maps and names and all of the things that Syuzanna just mentioned, not just for its own sake. It's not a feel good. It's because if you don't get that right, then the path to peace isn't a solid path. So that's my piece on this. Maral, your takeaways from the coverage, some of which obviously you've been following closely.
Sure. Thank you so much, Salpi, and thank you to USC Annenberg for hosting this panel today. The short answer to your question is, I think the international media coverage of the war in Artsakh left a lot to be desired, in my opinion, as a news consumer and as an Armenian. And if I had to say what my main critique was, I think it was the false equivalencies drawn between the two sides in the name of objectivity. And Syuzanna was just speaking to that a little bit in her presentation. So what does it mean to be objective? In journalism school, I'm a graduate of USC Annenberg. We learned that to be objective is to treat all sides to a conflict equally. But I believe that equally, yes. I believe there are certain situations in which that technique flattens the distinctions between parties to a conflict and obscures some of the complexities at play. And I think that the conflict in Artsakh is one such situation. So if I can just elaborate a bit on that. In the war last year, we saw Armenia, a small country of about 3 million people, and the Republic of Artsakh, an unrecognized state of approximately 150,000, fighting two much larger and wealthier nations in Azerbaijan and Turkey that were armed with far superior military technology. And for Armenians around the world, just to provide some of that context, Turkey's involvement in the conflict in Artsakh and its alliance with Azerbaijan in many ways recalled the history of the 1915 Armenian genocide, in which Armenians were exiled from our ancestral lands in Western Armenia. And Turkey's involvement in Artsakh is not an isolated incident either. This is part of a larger trend of interventionism in places like by the Turkish government in places like Libya and Syria that we've seen recently. So when you're looking at the 2020 Artsakh war, all of this context needs to be presented in order to accurately understand the events that unfolded last year. And unfortunately, and as someone who followed the international media coverage closely, I thought this nuance and this context was greatly lacking. And early on, I remember reading an article from the New York Times that described Artsakh as a remote mountain region in the Caucasus without much strategic importance to anyone. And yes, I remember reading that in one of the early articles. And I think that sort of framing was incredibly damaging because it obscured what for the Armenian side, and I'm speaking as an Armenian, was in many ways a battle for survival as indigenous peoples in the region. So I think coming back to my big takeaway, I believe that in covering complex international issues like Artsakh, rather than focus on antiquated notions of objectivity that result in perhaps false equivalencies, let's focus instead on fairness. And I think if we kind of reframe fairness as the goal, we will have better results in coverage of conflicts moving forward.
Thank you, Maral. Now I'm going to ask Professor Sandy Tolan to save us. Are we asking journalists to do what governments, and you're muted, Sandy, are we asking journalists and governments to do what societies have not been able to do? Is this too much? Maral is asking for nuance, for context, for understanding of consequences. Is that too much to ask for?
No, it's not. And Maral, I completely agree with you. I think one of the biggest problems in the conflicts that I've covered, and that mostly is encompassed by the Israel-Palestine. I've written 2 books about the issue. So mostly that's going to be my context in what I discuss. But I think it's not too much to expect journalists to be independent and to be independent thinkers. I mean, the great journalist, late Jonathan Schell, who wrote about nuclear weapons. He was a brilliant writer for the New Yorker. I remember when I was teaching at Berkeley, we had a conference on the coverage of the Iraq War right after it had started. And he talked about the Uber narrative. Like, what is the Uber narrative? Now, I don't know how much this relates to the coverage right now, but I think one of the things in terms of Mara's point of being independent, being aware of not falling into the trap of false equivalencies or false balance, is to find out, whether your perceptions are being fueled by a kind of national narrative, whether it's, the State Department or the sort of national culture. I mean, what happened in the Iraq War, in the whole notion of weapons of mass destruction, we all know that was, at this point, almost 20 years later, that was a fear-based. We were so afraid, the culture, the society there was so much fear that we went to embrace there was no fairness in this. There was the universal assumption that there were weapons of mass destruction, which was later proven to be not true. And so in this case, you had journalists basically piling on. The New York Times, and this has been well documented, it was one of the worst cases of journalistic malpractice that I know of. And it was done by, maybe our greatest newspaper. But they signed on. So part of it is this, as a journalist, you have to be unwilling to just blindly accept the narrative. You have to get on the ground and look for yourself. Now, this is complicated in wartime, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that in terms of my understanding in the coverage of Israel-Palestine. First of all, I think the Uber narrative for our culture, for our history, with many fine exceptions, is the notion that comes out of what I call the Exodus narrative, referring not to the Bible, but to Leon Uris's mega best-selling novel, which is basically the Jews deserve a state of their own, and they have to be safe. Fair enough, I understand, but what's the other side of the story? Where's the fairness there? Again, referring to Mara's point, what about the fact that 750,000 Palestinians were dispossessed? So that becomes a huge part of the unspoken narrative. And so when someone like Uris paints the Arabs, never referring to Palestinians as, vicious or stupid, or inept, and doesn't talk about the richness of their history in the land, that helps fuel a national understanding that one side is right and one side is undeserving. So that's part of it. Now, when you go to, so I think that this sort of Uber narrative, which I think is half true, that Israel deserves to be safe and secure, nobody ever says, very few people say, do Palestinians also need to be secure? So I think part of it is examining that Uber narrative. And I can talk a little bit more about Gaza and the coverage of Gaza, because I think, it does, when you get into the fog of war, it is much more complicated, but I have some thoughts on that I'm happy to share later.
I'm going to ask Adi to pick up where you left off about the journalist's role, willy-nilly, willingly, unwillingly, in developing these Uber narratives.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a very fair criticism. What Sandy said, we do develop narratives, and it's hard to push us off that. But I want to take this a little bit, the tragedy of what happened in this war, wasn't a journalistic failure. Armenia was unprepared for a war of this kind. I mean, to me, the big story is, this was in some ways a new kind of war, or it was a new approach to a long dormant war, or semi-simmering war, or something like that. That's what I would want people to understand. I mean, obviously, to understand the specific geopolitical, issues at stake, and to look for peaceful solutions to them. But something profound happened, and it was rewriting the rules of war in some ways. And I'm really talking about the effective and indiscriminate, practically, use of drones, presumably mostly from Turkey, that Azerbaijan used against civilian as well as military targets. I mean, that was a sort of profound thing. Now, so journalists on the ground maybe got it wrong. I mean, to be honest, some of the reporting from the government in Artsakh in the early days was way wrong. I mean, was way too optimistic, maybe strategically to keep up morale, but there were strains that didn't really contribute to objective truth. But at the end of the day, journalists are not very good at complexity.
That's not a good thing to say in the middle of this conversation, Audie. That's the whole point of this.
No, I wish we were better. My war experience was being in China during Tiananmen, and when that all happened, a lot of us were new to sort of conflict coverage, and it was the experienced people who knew you're going to hear a lot of stuff, and most of it is untrue. And we didn't know that, and we were hearing a lot of stuff. I mean, when the troops moved in against the students in '89 on the square in Tiananmen, suddenly there were reports in major U.S. newspapers that said there was a civil war scenario, and that part of the army of China had broken. And then a couple of days later, there was clearly no civil war, and there were reports about a peace treaty between I'm not sure any of that happened. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff. It is very hard to cover complexity. It is very hard to cover war. But I'm sort of positing that the real issues aren't here about coverage as much as about what did we just see, and what just happened in terms of the evolution of warfare, that in places that we would have said were kind of smaller, more regional conflicts.
So I'm going to push back a little bit and ask this question, because it is part of the complexity. That is, Armenians lost this war, clearly, and they weren't prepared, and many other things that analysts have pointed out. The other thing that analysts have pointed out is that the nature of the military assault was different. This is a 21st century war like one hasn't been fought yet. The asymmetry wasn't just in the loss, it was also in the waging of the war. But the other reality is that this is a sovereign nation, a government, Azerbaijan, Baku, that decided to attack its own citizens. And we lack a world order that prevents this kind of thing, regardless of territorial integrity and all of the other rights and responsibilities of a government, huh? A government attacking its own citizens. And being able to talk about those aspects of a war in order to get us towards peace. Sandy, do you want to jump in? And then we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to go to Maral and Suz with them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, the closest analogy that I have in terms of, my own expertise in Israel-Palestine, Palestinians are not citizens of Israel except for those who actually live within the state. But, it's essentially a one state with varying degrees of rights, and Gazans are under occupation from the sky and from the sea. So one of the things that I think the failure of the press in the 2014 war was, one is just accepting the American narrative a little too or much too quickly, but also creating these false equivalents where an entire family is wiped out, watching a soccer game or kids on the beach, and then the coverage the next day will have that, and next to it is someone whose house got hit by a rocket, but nobody was hurt. So there's this necessity to create a false equivalence. But I think in this case, and maybe it's relevant to what we're talking about here, is the lack of examination of firepower is a real problem. And I did the math at one point. A couple of the Hellfire missiles, I don't remember the exact numbers right now off the top of my head, that rained down on Gaza and created this 300-to-1 civilian casualty rate that nobody was talking about. Whenever I raised it, people said, well, let's not get into a numbers game. But if you look at the firepower, a couple of those missiles were equivalent to the entire amount of rockets that Hamas and Islamic Jihad sent in 2014 into Israel. So I think examining, I think, before a conflict starts, one has to ask where literally the journalist is coming from. A lot of journalists cover Gaza as a kind of, day trip. They live in Tel Aviv or West Jerusalem, and then they look at it as a kind of adventure, and they're not connected to the community. And so it's the other, it's the perpetual other. And then again, I think it's important to look at firepower.
Not just not connected to the community, not connected to the consequences. We've got a couple of questions, and they touch on some of this. Syuzanna, I'm going to ask you to answer because this is part of what you were dealing with during the war. A student, I think a student, asks, what would be your recommendations for students like me that want to do the type of work like covering the Karabakh conflict?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would echo what Professor Tolan said about going on the ground and making as many local contacts as you can and learning from them and what they have to say and what their history is. Examining the power dynamics, another thing that was mentioned, to learn exactly what the balance of power is between the two sides, and learning as much as you can basically about the topic. It's not about learning so much about how to write, but what you are writing. And logistically, remembering that when you're working with fixers and translators, remember that not all of them are affiliated with organizations who can provide them with helmets and vests. So when you're going to war areas, remember to think about those things. A lot of fixers were injured or hurt during the Karabakh War. And a lot of countries say that qualify helmets and vests as military gear. So it's very difficult to, ship 10 of them from the US or from a European country to smaller countries. So that was a big challenge, but all of those are things to think about.
The question was from Yannick Peterhans. People butcher my name and I don't often like it, so I apologize if I did that. Margarita Tavitian asks, journalists help to create narratives or support them by telling stories. Maral, you're going to take this one. In some cases, it helps to highlight issues on the ground. However, in such highly polarized conflict, at what point should journalists just report facts rather than tell a story? That's a tough one.
Thank you for that question. So I think that some of the best reporting in the international media that I saw of Artsakh told the human story. And I wanted to highlight in particular the Vice News report that we watched a clip of earlier, because those journalists, they were on the ground in Stepanakert, the regional capital of Artsakh, and they really focused, the human story anchored that report. But it was also placed in the larger historical context. And this was something that I wanted to talk about in today's panel, which was the responsibility that journalists have to, in some ways, create the historical record. So when you're going to a conflict zone and reporting on what's going on the ground, you also need to do your homework in advance. And I believe that to understand the war in Artsakh, you need to go back not just to the first Artsakh war, but you need to go back over 100 years in time and look at the history. So that's kind of a tall order. I'm going back to the student's question. That's a tall order for somebody who may not have any prior knowledge of the conflict. So how do you get up to speed? And that comes down to sourcing and to talking with people who have that knowledge, who have the expertise, and who have a personal connection, perhaps in some way. And to understand Artsakh, you need to talk with Armenian, to understand the Armenian side, I guess, you need to talk with Armenian scholars. And just because these individuals, they may have friends and family who are directly affected, that does not taint their perspective on the issue. I think it enhances it, because if you know the language, if you've studied this, and if you are personally affected in some way, I think you are best equipped to provide expertise that enhances, international media coverage. So I think I hope that I answered the question well.
I think you did, and I think that you opened up a thing that I want to pick up on, and I want to go to Adi. Adi, I know you wanted to add something as well. Maral just touched on it at the very end, but this has become a serious issue for marginalized communities throughout the United States, not just around the world. That is, if you are of that community, then maybe you're not the right person to cover that topic. And oddly enough, that only is relevant when the community about which we are speaking is a marginalized community. I was listening to a conversation among journalists the other day, and one said, nobody has ever said if you have a legal background, you can't go cover law issues. And if you're an accountant, you can't go cover, issues of scandal among accountants. But if you're trans, then you can't cover trans issues. And if you're Armenian, you sure can't cover Armenian issues. Pick up on that, Adi, please, and then go wherever you want.
Well, so I think it's actually more complex, because I'm finding that in the question of appropriation, we're actually saying that Asians can only write about Asian issues, or African Americans can only write about African American issues. So I'm not quite sure that works across the way. Look, I think it's tough for Armenians to objectively cover a war that involves Armenia. I mean, we were talking about the Iraq War. Sandy was talking about the Iraq War. When your nation goes to war, journalists who normally question authority, and that's what they do, and they do it very comfortably. When their nation goes to war, journalists tend to line up, and not completely. But the example of the New York Times, they lined up, and certain reporters lined up with a narrative that didn't hold water even slightly. The sort of WMD question, which was probably the wrong question to ask anyway, but then the answer wasn't even what the government sort of purported to be, and yet still reporters get caught up in it. They would probably deny that they do, but there is a sort of jingoism that gets built in. So I think it is tough for people to cover a war that involves their own ethnic. It's not impossible, and the best journalists can do it, but I think that's a fair red flag. I just want to add briefly the conversation before about how do you cover an ethnic conflict where you have, you try not to fall for false equivalencies, but these guys seem to say something compelling and the other guys seem to say something compelling. At the very least, and this war bore it out, just think of a few basic rules. Is one side indiscriminately bombing civilians? Who is the aggressor? Who is backing the aggressor? What is the nature of the weaponry? Now, not all of that is immediately discoverable or immediately easily discoverable, but I think there's certain basic questions that even if you feel like I'm not equipped to understand the deep historical complexity, you could still weigh in on some pretty fundamental questions as to who's the aggressor, who is killing civilians, things like that you should be able to talk about strongly, without any kind of equivalency.
Can I just jump in for a second? I just want to, I totally agree with that. I mean, and there is a difficulty with, people from, say, the US journalists, in the middle of this atmosphere of great fear. But I think it's incumbent upon us as independent thinkers to try, and you had anchors wearing lapel pins of the American flag, if you might recall, during that time. So but I also wanted to go back to something that Mar said, which is the need. She talked about fixers. I mean, for those who are coming into a conflict, I remember once a Pakistani journalist told me that he was a fixer for an unnamed. He was too polite to name the publication or the journalist who came to Pakistan right after 9/11. And I can't remember if it was Islamabad or where it was, but he said, the journalist said to this Pakistani journalist, take me to the terrorist neighborhood. He had already written the story in his head. He wasn't really interested in doing anything except for to confirm his preconceived story, which was assigned by his editors. But I think, you know, as independent journalists, we should be reading history. We should be talking to poets and musicians, and we should be talking to people who are deeply embedded in various sides of the conflict, so that we really understand. And again, it depends on where you want to start. I mean, Adi, you mentioned, I think earlier, certain dates, or somebody mentioned certain dates, but you could also say, you know, in Palestine, you want to start in 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, or do you want to talk about 1948, or do you want to go back to the, you know, one of the Zionist conferences in 1890s, you know? So, but knowing that you could start in different places comes from like a deep reading. And even if you're parachuting, you can shortcut by getting to the people who know what you need to know and figuring out who those people are. I think the best journalists can do that.
How much of what a journalist does is written with an assumption of the audience in mind? What drives the, I mean, I know we know our audience and our market, and that's who we sell to, but still, how much of this avoidance of complexity, fear of overburdening with history and geography and the unpronounceable and the unlocatable and the map is driven by a fear of the audience, its capacity, losing the audience? Sandy, would you continue with that? And then, is it? Am I wrong? You're on mute.
As Adi was saying, we don't do complexity well, and I think there is, you know, there is a tendency when there isn't a lot of depth in the reporting or the published reporting that came before, if not a lot that has happened before. I think that people need to, you know, the publications, the news outlets are the ones that are scrambling as much as the reporter, because they have to figure out how to educate their audience without making it seem overly simplistic. And I think that's what, I mean, you'll see, say in the LA Times, they do a lot of Q&As where the reporter writes the questions and the answers, because you're trying to explain it. It's, you know, an explainer. But I think there is an aversion to complexity, partly because, I mean, news holes have shrunk over the years, and there isn't the time. I mean, NPR, I used to joke with, or I used to tell my editors at NPR, I can't do that story in 8.5 minutes, impossible. And now if you have 6 minutes, it's an eternity on public radio. So that's part of the cultural problem with shrinking, this sort of USA Todayification of the news, if you will.
Rich Almoyan has a question that I'm going to ask Adi about, but I also want Maral or Suz to chime in on this, because it's impacted the coverage as we've seen it. Adi, the question is, what other situations are there to learn from regarding the landlocked nature of this conflict and the geographic limitations for journalists accessing the front line? Because, I mean, the implication here, of course, is that, you know, Qarabakh controlled its borders. And so if you wanted to go, you pretty much could only go from the Armenian side. And if you went to Azerbaijan, then from the Azerbaijani side, you often were not taken to their borders. And so this automatically limits your ability to cover both sides. Are there other examples of this?
Probably. I'm not sure I can think of any right now. I mean, covering war is difficult, and during the Iraq War, the Americans who tended to cover it were embedded with U.S. troops. There were some journalistic groups who thought you should never accept that you're collaborating with one side, or you're too close to one side. I was running foreign coverage for Time magazine. I thought that was better than nothing, that you had a chance, but you have to know what you're doing. You're embedded with U.S. soldiers and surrounded by them and hanging out with them and becoming friends with them and getting that perspective. So you have to keep that in mind, but you're still getting access to the battleground, which we decided then and we're talking about now is of value to write the first draft of history, to be there and to be an eyewitness. So it's always hard to cover war, and I'm sure there are a lot of examples. Maybe other people can think of them, but it's always going to be, to be safe, you're likely going to be accepting, if not somebody's protection, then deciding to be on the correct side of where the guns are. You're making these calculations that will just limit your access.
Syuzanna, I want you to chime in, because this was one of the issues with some of the New York Times coverage, right?
Right. Yeah, just going off of what Adi was saying, also another main concern was a security issue with the, getting access, and because during the war, there's so much information leaking to the other side, everybody becomes sort of more closed off and no one wants to anything filmed, anything shared, much less, on the front line where all the weaponry and all of that stuff is visible. So that was certainly a challenge. And as the war progressed, it became even more and more difficult to be able to access the front lines. But sorry, Salpi, what did you want me also to touch on?
Well, let me just say it real quick, because we're running out of time, and there may be one or two questions I still need to get to. One of the problems with the New York Times coverage was specifically because the New York Times journalist was the Istanbul chief. She went through Baku. If you go through Baku, you have handlers, government companions, and are not brought to the Karabakh front line. But that context was missing from the story, which really made a lot of people angry. With that context, it was a fine story. Mm-hmm. It was a perfectly fine story of the Azerbaijani perspective. And yet those two lines were missing and made it, an unnecessary topic of controversy, simply because the context was not offered. I want to get to two questions if I can. Maral, you get this one, because I know you've been working at Gould with the Human Rights Clinic as well, that Hannah Gary runs, and several other students we're working with. So this is the question. To what extent, and I think this is Professor Renteln, if I'm not wrong, to what extent are journalists properly covering responses by international institutions, the UN, the ICC, Human Rights Council, covering their responses to the conflict in Artsakh, or their lack of response? What more should be said about relevant human rights treaties related to genocide, cultural heritage?
Thank you so much, Professor Renteln, for that question. I was in Professor Renteln's International Human Rights Law seminar last semester, and she was a dear mentor of mine from undergrad at USC as well. My answer to that question, and as a law student, as somebody who's interested in human rights issues, is that the human rights angle was not covered enough in the international media reporting on Artsakh. And specifically, I think the issue of desecration of Armenian cultural heritage sites is very relevant right now, because almost 1,500 ancient Armenian monuments and cultural heritage sites have now fallen under the jurisdiction of the Azerbaijani government as a result of the territorial exchanges in the aftermath of the ceasefire. And we have seen videos of some of those monuments already being desecrated and in some cases destroyed. And the responsibility to protect cultural heritage is something that, it's a nonpartisan and apolitical issue. And Azerbaijan has obligations under UNESCO to ensure the protection of Armenian cultural heritage sites. And yet, in some of the reporting that we've seen, about this ongoing situation, there's been sort of this back and forth of the Armenian side saying, we're seeing the destruction of our ancient cultural heritage, and representatives of the Azerbaijani government are flatly denying that this is happening, despite there being videos of the conduct. And I think this is a situation in which it's the journalist's responsibility to kind of call it what it is. We don't need to have a quote from a representative of the Azerbaijani government denying that this destruction is happening when we have videos and firsthand sources showing this, what is going on. And I think that, I hope that answers Professor Rentown's question a little bit, that, the commentary on what are the obligations of state parties to human rights treaties, that is something that, it's very clear. And we don't need to contribute to this both-sidism in talking about those obligations.
Thank you, Maral. We're out of time. I'm going to ask everybody to take exactly 1 minute, timing you 1 minute, to answer the question that we asked. How do you cover invisible conflicts in places you cannot pronounce? As you think about it, I just want to add something to both the question and the answer. And that is that for people like me who believe in internationalism, who believe that, if a cultural heritage, if a cultural site was built 500 years ago by Armenians in a village, and today it is in fact, in Myanmar, there is one, in Bangladesh, there is one, there are several in the territory of Azerbaijan, many, and so forth. That's one thing, and that's fine. That by itself is not a problem. It's the respect or lack of respect towards cultural heritage that's the problem. And that is what then drives the animosity that prevents peace and prevents cohabitation and takes us back to borders and all of the other complexities that man creates for himself really well. So I just wanted to get that in. It's not simply where the heritage site is, but how it's treated or maltreated. We're going to go all the way around. We're going to end up with Adi. We're going to start with Sandy, go to Syuzanna, Maral, and then Adi. How do you do this? How do you cover unpronounceable places far away?
Well, I want to just, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
You get 1 minute, Sandy.
Yeah, so I just want to use one example. And I don't know that we can't pronounce Iraq, but I'm sure there are many provinces that we might have trouble pronouncing. So I'm gonna use that. It's important to get creative. Adi talked about embedding is better than nothing, and to some extent I agree. But I can remember the great and late Anthony Shadid, who was was under fire in Iraq, kidnapped in Libya, persona non grata in Egypt, and died of an asthma attack on the Turkish-Syrian border, of all things. He was, to me, the quintessential independent, great international journalist. Now, the Washington Post had a guy, also a very good journalist named Steve Fornero. I'm mispronouncing his name, but they did a piece that, okay, I'm going to finish. They did a piece where he was embedded and Anthony was not. And they wrote a piece together that was like a 4,000 word piece that told the whole story. So my answer is, in 2 words, get creative.
Thank you, Professor Sandy Tolan. I forgot, Maral or Sue's next?
I'll go next.
Okay.
As Adi said a few times, wars are very difficult to cover. So my 2 cents would be just read about it as much as you can and go local, go there and make your contacts and talk to the people on the ground.
Thank you, Syuzanna Petrosyan. Maral Tavitian?
Yeah, I think that I agree with what Sue said. My recommendation would be focus on the human story, but place that human story in historical context. Context is so important when you're covering something as complex as the conflict in Artsakh. And I think just do your homework as a journalist and know the history, because you are creating a historical record, and that is an issue of professional responsibility and journalistic ethics. So take that seriously.
Thank you, Maral. Adi Ignatius.
Yeah, these are all great. So, this gets back to a point we were talking about before. How do you tell these complex stories? And, storytelling is part of the craft. I mean, part of it is fact gathering and understanding nuance and context, but part of it is storytelling. And, I think of somebody like my brother, David Ignatius, does that very well. Tom Friedman, takes complex things and comes up with ways that, seen some head shaking, but whether you agree with them or not, comes up with nuggets so you can think about a complex issue you maybe have not thought about before. I would, we've talked several times about the Vice coverage. Maybe we can put a link in the comments box. I mean, there was a lot of heart in that, of being there and really hearing people's stories and being at risk and just being there. The last thing I would say is, I believe, there was a question that came in, journalists are humans, how could you be objective? And that's true. We're not going to be completely objective, but I trust a good reporter and I trust a veteran reporter to do the reporting, to read the history, as we said, and then shape a story that is not he said, she said with complete equivalencies, but is a shaped narrative based on their legwork and the facts on the ground, that a journalist who does that kind of reporting earns the right to be able to tell a story that has truth beyond just sort of facts and false equivalent, counterfacts.
Thank you, Adi Ignatius. That question was from Sylvie Tertsagian. I want to thank all the questions, including the ones we didn't get to, and thank all of you. I want to add my one minute's worth, and that is that I think the journalist must be aware that a story has consequences. Yes, it's a primary source of history. That's a consequence, but it's also got a consequence if the situation really is as dire as one that leads to this, a crisis and war. The consequences are going to be important, and there's responsibility there. We're grateful to have the great journalists and the great journalistic outlets that we still have. And I hope very much that in this very complex time, Gordon Stables, all of your students, and the future of journalism is bright, because we sure as heck need them all. So thank you, Gordon. Thank you to the School of Journalism. Thank you to all of you. And thank you to those of you who watch. This will remain on YouTube on the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies YouTube channel. Grateful to you all. Thank you.